Okay, so let me just open this up a little. Thought I had it, but I guess I moved just a tad. All right, I am Melanie Koss. I'm from Northern Illinois University. Let me start my timer. My colleague, Katie Paciga, is from Columbia College, and she is not able to join us today. So we're going to talk today totally in a different topic about curricular freedom in today's contemporary sociopolitical and sociocultural content. Oh, and now my screen is paused. Okay. Can you see it now? Okay. So the purpose for today is to, we did a study exploring teachers' perceptions of the curricular freedom they had over children's literature they could bring into their classroom, whether it's through a whole group or a small group actual curricular lesson, a read aloud, or just for inclusion in their classroom library. And a little bit of context for why we feel this important is there is an increased emphasis on censorship and book challenges going on in today's world. Just from the first 8 months of 2022, there were 681 book challenges, which is more than double the same period of time from 2021. And there's been a 250% increase in these education gag order bills, such as the parental rights in Florida, which is also called the Don't Say Gay bill. Those are educational gag order bills, bills that prevent what certain things can be taught in the classroom. And 137 of the bills similar to this, a 250% increase, have been introduced by the end of 2022. The number obviously is higher from there. So there is this huge, oops, moving this slightly. I can see my notes, bear with me. So the number is slightly higher already. And then in conjunction with all of this censorship is this idea of media literacy. So teachers receive policies and procedures from their schools, which can relate to those educational gag orders, or they're seeing or hearing on the national news media about some of these censorship attempts. And all of this is going to shape their own personal perceptions of these policies because teachers will use their own media literacy in their practice. So teachers automatically take a look at what's happening in the trends nationally or in their state, and that's going to reflect how they think about the ways that they can teach. So the framework that we were looking at for this study was, we're starting with teacher autonomy. And we talked about this in this sort of progression between capacity, self-direction, and freedom. So we define capacity as how well equipped teachers feel and how they select the materials for their teaching. Self-direction is so capacity is how equipped they feel. Self-direction is their ability to actually make those selections independent of outside influences. So that's their own individual moral gatekeeping or decision-making. And then freedom is their ability to select materials as impacted by outside influences, which could be administration or curricular constraints or parent involvement. So in order to look at these three constructs of teacher autonomy, we're using Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory of human development, where you start with your micro, your individual, and how you have your own thought processes, and it extrapolates outward, meso, exo, macro. So for the purpose of today, our micro is individual, our meso is the local area, so your district and your school. The exo will be state, and the macro is nation and what's happening. And we're using this along with Ehrenfeld's teacher professional development to talk about how teachers develop their professional identities within these different levels of their communities. And so their media literacy, along with interactions from their personal, family, or religious institution or peers, their state and their local, can all interact dynamically to impact how teachers perceive their curricular freedom. So I had a large study that we had a giant survey and interviews looking at teachers' perceptions of their autonomy in those three constructs. But for the purpose of today, we were looking at what topics the pre-K to 8 teachers mentioned in relation to their curricular freedom, across what components or dimensions of the social ecological framework were visible, and are there any regional differences? So to quickly go through our methodology, we did a large internet survey, and we focused on those 3 constructs of teacher autonomy. And for today's presentation, we're focusing on one of our open-ended questions, which was, describe any recent events or experiences that impact your view on the topic of teacher control over children's books included in the curriculum. So our data sources, we had 503 teachers across the US, which was a 4.82 response rate. We had over 1,000 responses, but 503 specifically responded to this question. And they were broken down across the 5 regions of the US. The Southwest was by far the lowest, as was the Northeast. We had a hard time getting those sample, and the Southeast really wanted to share their thoughts with us. So they were our largest. And we used constant comparative method. So our open coding began with those codes aligned to the levels of Bronfenbrenner's model. And then our axial coding, we went a little bit deeper into themes within each one of those open codes, and then selective coding further themes and regional variations. So we identified themes and subthemes, calculated frequency and percentages, and then examined for regional variation. And I want to point out, I'm focusing today, all the charts and everything that I'm going to share with you are going to be the percentages and not the raw numbers, because since there was not an equal number in each of the regions, the percentages give a slightly better, view of what we found. And because we have 15 minutes and there's a lot of data, I'm just going to highlight a few key results from each region. And just again, overall, you can see that we weren't perfectly split across, but looking down, there was a fairly decent response rate for individual, local, and nation, and the state was a bit low. So it kind of reflects it on this chart. Moving forward, what I do want to show, this is just an example of how we coded. So this is just for individual. And today, we're only going to talk primarily about these 3 sub-themes, with the understanding that all of these different things fall in these were our open coding, and then this was our axial coding, and this was all of our selective. So this is just a reference for you. So first I wanted to talk about individual, which is that micro. And of the 3 categories that we had here, insular individual responses. So these are responses that individuals said how things in my life, just in my life, are impacting my teacher. So my students, my classroom. Comparative was my classroom and my teaching as compared to what's happening in the wider world, and their professionalism and curricular freedom. So those were the 3 main themes that came out at the individual level. And the ones that really stood out to us were these 3 over 50%. So you can see that the Northeast and the West really focused on their individual teaching practices. However, the Southeast here, they really talked about their teaching practices in comparison to other things that were happening in their wider sphere, like the nation and the state. So to highlight those, we noticed that, again, I'm just kind of showing you in different visual ways, the Northeast and the West are purple and are orange. Most of theirs really focused on talking about they wanted to include, they had autonomy over literature that meets their students' needs. So they either did or didn't have autonomy, but this was their focus. Whereas Southeast, and I do want to note that of our Southeast, 40% of them are from the state of Florida. Florida really wanted to talk to us. And what they were commenting about is that their teacher autonomy, their autonomy over bringing materials into their classroom was significantly impacted by the sociocultural content. And I noticed that there is a hidden box right there. It's censorship. I wasn't able to move that out of the way. So here's just an example of those, and I'm only going to do one for time purposes because I'm not going as fast as I wanted. So one example of the Northeast and the West who are focused on the material is they're saying, I prefer books that are relevant and authentic. I like to change the books I use based on the children in my classroom, their interests, and anything that helps tie learning standards together. In contrast, in the Southeast, they were talking, the red is the piece of their answer that was coded at the individual level. So for example, Virginia would be coded at the state level. So someone in Virginia said, what's happening in Virginia is scary. There's so much I'm afraid to teach because of these crazy tip lines. I'm not supposed to teach anything about race because critical race theory is scary and might make white kiddos uncomfortable, but what about my Black kiddos? I don't really know what critical race theory is, and I don't think most administrators and parents know either, neither does the governor. So there's a very big difference between the type of responses that the teachers were saying. At the local level, at first glance, we noted that it appears that the Northeast is not that different. But when we looked deeper across our themes, the Northeast was very high in curriculum and professional development. Specifically, they focused on, that they did not have choice and they had too much restriction. So that was their focus in those two. So if we drill down, an example of someone from the Northeast who said, I didn't have enough choice and too much restriction. This year, my district mandated we exclusively use Amplify with fidelity, and it has not gone well. At the state level then, so we first did individual and then we talked about local, which is how their school and district was impacting them. State was the lowest response, but what was interesting to us, Northeast was the lowest, but they had the highest percent responding about CRT and book banning with the state's control. And the Southeast was our highest, and they were very fearful of what was happening in their state. So you can see clearly on this chart, the Southeast was fearful and the Northeast focused on book banning. And a few quick comments on that. So at the state level, for example, I worry at the bottom one, I worry about the recent legislation our governor has signed that impacts schools in the classroom. Whereas the people in the Northeast regularly mentioned another state, often Florida. And so they were concerned about censorship, not in their own state, but in what they're seeing happening elsewhere. So the events in Florida are appalling. There have occasionally been issues in Vermont with parents having input into book inclusion, but for the most part, we're supported. Lastly, at the national level, what we noted was that it seemed that the Northeast was the highest and the Southeast was the lowest, which we thought the Northeast was looking at the whole nation, and the Southeast, there's a lot going on there. They're really focused at home in their own front yard. But we noticed across the board, all teachers across all of the regions really had an emphasis on censorship. Very clear if you look across our major themes, this is where it fell. And the two areas it fell, it was censorship, and something about censorship was specifically mentioned. And also a concern about the topics that were being covered. And CRT, race, and LGBT were the most specific. So examples for the national was, it appears that a lot of groups, usually politically motivated, have attempted to ban or control what books are used in classrooms. And I want to point out this bottom one, because they're not all conservative and right wing that are saying this. We are getting, that's what sort of, that was the primary, but we also did have quite a few teachers who expressed that they were more conservative and were made very uncomfortable with policies being from the far left as well. Across all of the regions, teachers are really thinking differently about sociocultural issues, and that's so situated to where you live. And when we looked at it and took a step back, if you look at the map of the United States and which states are traditionally red or traditionally blue, the Northeast and the West overall tend to be a bit more blue, and they have the highest responses of concern at the national level. Whereas the Southeast and the Southwest tended to be a bit more red, and they had the highest responses at the individual and state level. And the Midwest is mixed a bit politically, and they did tend then to be in the middle. And so as Freire suggests, all education is political and teaching is never a neutral act. So we really are looking at how these meso, exo, and macro levels are really still impacting teachers' individual micro-curricular freedom. And we're tying a lot of this back to where the national news media is so saturated. Whichever news media that if you're looking at media that's on the right, in the middle, or on the left, you're still hearing about this issue, maybe in different ways. And so teachers are hearing about national news media and issues of censorship, and they're then being impacted when they have to personally reflect as to where their individual teaching is being impacted and how much control and curricular freedom they have.